My name is Cora. Before I was Cora Sterling, I was Cora Shaw, a girl who grew up in a small house that smelled of old books and damp earth, raised by a grandmother who taught me that the quietest things in the world, a seed, a thought, a truth, were often the most powerful. I spent my early 20s working as an archivist, finding a deep, steady comfort in the meticulous work of preserving stories, of bringing order to the scattered fragments of the past. I loved the feel of aged paper, the scent of ink, the hushed reverence of the archives. It was a world that made sense, a world where every piece had its place. Then I met Julian Sterling. He was like a sudden burst of color in my monochrome life, charming, attentive, with a smile that seemed to promise a world far bigger and brighter than the one I knew. He didn't seem to mind my quiet nature. He said he found it calming, a peaceful harbor in the storm of his own life. The storm, I would later learn, was his family. The Sterlings were not just wealthy, they were an institution in Port Meridian, a dynasty built on timber, shipping, and shrewd investments that had shaped the city's skyline. Their name was etched onto museum wings and university libraries. To marry Julian was to be absorbed into that institution, to become a footnote in their grand, sprawling narrative. For 3 years, I tried. I learned to navigate the treacherous currents of their world, a world of unspoken rules, of glittering surfaces that concealed sharp edges. I traded my comfortable cardigans for designer dresses that never felt like my own. I learned to hold a wine glass just so, to smile politely at jokes that weren't funny, to keep my opinions folded neatly away like old letters, stored in a box I never opened. I told myself this was love. I told myself this was compromise. But deep down, in the quiet archives of my own heart, I knew I was slowly erasing myself. The night it all shattered was Alastair Sterling's 70th birthday. The party was held at their estate on Stelmer Island, a fortress of glass and stone perched on a bluff overlooking the Sound. The air was thick with the scent of pine and salt, a wild, beautiful smell that was entirely at odds with the stifling atmosphere inside. The house was ablaze with light, every window a golden square against the deepening twilight, a beacon of power and untouchable wealth. I stood on the periphery, a ghost at the feast, watching Julian stand beside his father. They were a matched set, both tall and handsome, with the same easy confidence that came from a lifetime of never being told no. Alastair Sterling was the patriarch in every sense of the word, a man whose presence filled a room, whose pronouncements were received as gospel. He ruled his family and his business with an iron will sheathed in a velvet glove of performative charm. I was trying to be useful, to be a part of the seamless choreography of the evening. I was carrying a bottle of Cabernet, intending to refill a guest's glass, when I moved behind Alastair's chair. My heel, a bit too high, a bit too unfamiliar, caught on the edge of the thick Persian rug. It was a small stumble, a clumsy, human moment in a room where humanity was kept carefully out of sight. The wine, a deep blood red, arced through the air and splashed across the pristine white of Alastair's shirt. A hush fell over the room, sudden and absolute. It was not a quiet of concern, but of judgment, a collective intake of breath as everyone waited to see how the king would react to this affront. Alastair turned, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. His eyes, the same piercing blue as Julian's, locked onto mine. "You clumsy little fool," he said, his voice low but carrying across the cavernous room. I opened my mouth to apologize, the words ready on my tongue, the familiar script of appeasement I had learned so well. But before I could speak, his hand shot out. It wasn't a punch, it was a slap, open-palmed and vicious, the crack of it echoing in the sudden silence. The force of it snapped my head to the side, and a sharp, stinging pain bloomed across my cheek. I staggered back, my hand flying to my face, tasting the coppery tang of blood from my lip. The marble floor felt impossibly cold beneath my feet. The 50 or so guests stood frozen, their faces a gallery of reactions, shock, pity, and in a few unsettling cases, a flicker of cruel satisfaction. No one moved. No one spoke. I looked for Julian, my husband, my protector. He stood frozen by his father's side, his face pale, his expression unreadable. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at his father. "Apologize to my father," Julian said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "Or leave." The words struck me with more force than the slap. It wasn't just a command, it was a choice he was presenting me with, a declaration of allegiance. And he wasn't choosing me. In that moment, the illusion I had so carefully constructed for 3 years crumbled into dust. This wasn't a family. It was a hierarchy. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, where I stood. I lowered my hand from my face, my fingers coming away slick with blood. I looked at the small, crimson smear, then back at the silent, watching crowd. I thought of my grandmother, her calloused hands tending to her garden, her voice telling me, "Don't ever let anyone make your world small, little bird. You were born for the sky." I picked up a silk napkin from the table, dabbed my bleeding lip with a steady hand, and straightened my spine. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply turned and walked away. The sound of my heels on the marble floor was the only noise in the room, a rhythmic, deliberate tapping that echoed my departure. Each step was a severing, a cutting of the ties that had bound me to this cold, gilded cage. When I stepped outside, the cool, misty air was a balm on my burning cheek. The world felt vast and silent. I found my car at the end of the long, gravel driveway and slid inside, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. For a long moment, I just sat there, breathing in the scent of my own ordinary car, a scent of freedom. The drive back to the city across the ferry was a blur of dark water and distant lights. When I finally walked into my apartment, the one I had insisted on keeping, my own small sanctuary in the city, my phone began to buzz. I tossed it onto the sofa and kicked off my shoes. It buzzed again and again, relentlessly. I finally picked it up. The screen glowed with a number I knew I would never forget, 68 missed calls. From Julian, from his mother, from Alistair himself. What could they possibly want? What more was there to say? Before I could decide what to do, a text message lit up the screen, a name I hadn't expected. It wasn't from them. It was from an old friend, a journalist I hadn't spoken to in months. "Be careful, Cora," it read. "I'm hearing whispers. Alistair Sterling doesn't let anyone walk away." A cold dread washed over me. I had left the party, but I was beginning to understand that I hadn't truly escaped. Not yet. I sat on the edge of my bed, the place I always retreated to when the world felt too heavy. My small apartment, usually a haven of soft light and familiar comforts, felt fragile, its walls too thin to keep out the shadow of the Sterling Empire. The memory of the party clung to me like the damp Port Meridian air, the glitter, the judgment, the sharp, metallic taste of my own blood. My phone, which I'd silenced, pulsed with silent, insistent light from the nightstand. 68 missed calls had become 94. The texts were a relentless stream of commands disguised as concern. "Cora, pick up the phone. We need to talk." That was Julian, his tone likely reasonable, pleading, as if this were a simple misunderstanding. "You embarrass this family. You will show my husband the respect he deserves." That was his mother, Genevieve, a woman whose warmth was as carefully curated as the roses in her garden. "Do not make this a bigger problem than it needs to be. Think about your future." That was Alistair. Not a threat, not yet. Just a warning, delivered with the casual authority of a man who owned the world and everyone in it. I scrolled through them, my thumb moving numbly over the screen. Each message was a small, sharp jab, reinforcing the narrative that I was the one who had erred. I was the one who had broken the peace. Then I saw a voicemail I had overlooked. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I pressed play, needing to hear the unvarnished truth of it. Alistair's voice, smooth as polished mahogany, filled the quiet room. "Cora, what happened last night was unfortunate. A lapse in judgment, fueled by emotion. But let me be perfectly clear. If you choose to make this incident public, if you attempt to damage my reputation in any way, I will ensure you have nothing left. My legal team is the best in the state. They will dismantle your life piece by piece. Consider this a kindness. Stay silent." The line went dead. I held the phone in my hand, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the threat itself that shocked me, but it's cold, calculated delivery. He wasn't angry. He was strategic. This was a business transaction, and I was a liability to be managed. I closed my eyes, and the sterile coldness of his voice faded, replaced by another, warmer and softer. My grandmother, her hands smelling of soil and chamomile, sitting with me on her porch swing. I was 12, and a girl at school had been spreading cruel rumors about me. I'd come home wanting to hide, to become invisible. Hiding doesn't make the shadows go away, little bird, she had told me, her voice a gentle rumble. It just gives them more room to grow. Sometimes, the only way to find the light is to stand up and be your own sun. What would she think of me now? The woman who had spent 3 years shrinking, making herself smaller and smaller to fit into a space that was never meant for her? I remembered another dinner, months ago, when Alistair had remarked to a table of his powerful friends that it was a testament to Julian's good nature that he'd married a girl with no background to speak of. Julian had just smiled, a tight, uncomfortable twitch of his lips, and changed the subject. He hadn't defended me. He had managed the moment, just as his father was trying to manage this one. The memory, once a dull ache, was now a sharp, clarifying pain. I pushed myself off the bed and walked to the antique writing desk in the corner, a piece I'd inherited from my grandmother. Tucked in the back of a drawer, beneath a stack of old postcards, was a leather-bound journal. I hadn't written in it for years. I'd started it when I first met Julian, a place to record the dizzying newness of it all. But over time, it had become a secret ledger of slights, a silent archive of my own slow erasure. I flipped through the pages. The date Alistair joked that my education was quaint but ultimately decorative. The time Genevieve politely suggested I take etiquette classes to better represent the family. The casual way Julian would dismiss my career as a hobby. Each entry was a small stone, and I hadn't realized I'd been carrying the weight of all of them. This wasn't just a diary. This was my story. And Alistair Sterling wasn't going to be the one to write the ending. My phone buzzed again, a text from Julian. "I'm coming over. We're fixing this." Not "I'm sorry." Not "are you okay?" But "we're fixing this." I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, my hand surprisingly steady. On the counter lay the silk napkin from the party, its crimson stain now a dark, ugly brown. A fragile piece of fabric, but it felt like a declaration. I wouldn't let them wash it away. I wouldn't let them pretend it didn't happen. "No," I whispered to the empty room. The word was quiet, but it resonated with a strength I hadn't felt in years. "I'm fixing this." I turned off my phone, cutting off the flood of their demands. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty. It was expectant. It was the calm before the storm, but for the first time, I felt ready to face the rain. I didn't know how far they would go to silence me, but I was about to find out just how far I would go to be heard. The morning light was a pale, watery gray, filtering through the blinds and striping the floor. I hadn't slept, but I wasn't tired. I felt a strange, brittle energy, the kind that comes after a fever has broken. The world outside my window was moving on, the groan of the ferry, the cry of gulls, the rumble of early morning traffic. It was just another Tuesday in Port Meridian, but for me, everything had changed. I made coffee, the real kind, grinding the beans myself. The rich, dark aroma filled my small kitchen, a simple, grounding ritual. As it brewed, I turned my phone back on. The predictable deluge of notifications appeared, but I ignored them. Instead, I opened my laptop. An email was waiting for me, sent at 3 a.m. from the Sterling Holdings corporate account. It was from Alistair's executive assistant. Per Mr. Sterling's directive, your discretion is not a request, it is a condition of any amicable separation. Any public statement will be met with immediate and severe legal repercussions. He couldn't even threaten me himself. He delegated it, just another unpleasant task for his staff to handle. It was about control, pure and simple. Keeping me in my box, the one they had so carefully constructed for me. And Julian. Julian knew. He had to be a part of this. The man who once promised me a lifetime of partnership was now complicit in trying to muzzle me. I thought of the prenuptial agreement they'd had me sign a week before the wedding. Julian had presented it as a formality, just what his father's lawyers advised. I'd been so in love, so eager to prove I wasn't after his money, that I'd signed it without reading every clause. I felt a flush of shame, remembering my own naivety. I hadn't been signing a document, I had been signing away my power. A cold, clear anger, sharp as shattered glass, cut through the last vestiges of my fear. I walked back to my grandmother's desk and opened the journal again. I turned to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "The Sterling Archive." My handwriting was no longer shaky, it was precise, the deliberate script of an archivist at work. I began to list everything: dates, incidents, direct quotes, the subtle threats, and the overt ones. It was no longer a record of my pain, it was a catalog of their transgressions. Then an idea took root. If they were going to treat this like a legal battle, then I needed more than a journal. I needed an ally. Not a high-powered lawyer I couldn't afford, but someone who understood the city's underbelly, someone who knew how men like Alistair Sterling operated. It took me an hour to draft the text to Julian. Each word was carefully chosen, stripped of emotion. Meet me. 10 a.m. The Grindhouse Cafe. Alone. His reply was instantaneous. Okay. He didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He was coming to manage the situation, to smooth things over, to get his disobedient wife back in line. The Grindhouse Cafe was on the other side of town, a place with worn wooden floors, mismatched chairs, and the rich, comforting smell of coffee and old books. It was neutral ground, a world away from the Sterling's polished marble and crystal. I chose a small table in the back corner and ordered a black coffee, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. Julian arrived 10 minutes late, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, though he loosened his tie, an attempt at casualness that didn't reach his eyes. He looked tired, but his posture was still rigid with the familiar Sterling entitlement. "Cora," he began, his voice low and placating. "I'm glad you reached out." I didn't smile. "Why did you let him do it, Julian?" I asked, my voice steady. "He slapped me. In a room full of people. And you told me to apologize." His gaze flickered away, landing on the sugar dispenser on the table. He was angry. He'd been drinking. You know my father's temper. The excuse was so flimsy, so insulting, that a bitter laugh escaped me. His temper? Is that what we're calling it? He assaulted me, Julian. He humiliated me. And you just stood there. He sighed, a long-suffering sound that set my teeth on edge. You're blowing this out of proportion. It was one mistake. If I would just what? I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a fierce whisper. If I would just accept it? If I would just go back to that house and pretend it never happened? Let your father treat me like a possession he can discipline whenever he feels like it. He finally met my eyes, and in their depths I saw it. Not guilt. Not love. Fear. Raw, undiluted fear. You don't understand, he said, his voice strained. My father, he controls everything. The trust fund, my position at the company, our entire life. If you make an enemy of him, he will crush us. Both of us. Us. The word was a lie. There was no us in his equation. There was only him, his inheritance, and his father's approval. I have one question for you, Julian, I said, my voice trembling with a rage I had suppressed for years. If that had been your sister standing there, if your father had slapped her, would you have told her to apologize? He flinched, his jaw tightening. He had no answer. If you really loved me, he said finally, falling back on the oldest manipulation in the book, you would help me keep the peace. Just apologize. For me. Apologize. The word hung in the air between us, ugly and final. He was asking me to trade my dignity for his comfort. He was asking me to erase my own reality to preserve his. That was it. The last, frayed thread connecting us finally snapped. I stood up, the legs of my chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. A few patrons glanced over. Julian, he started, reaching for my hand, but I pulled it away. If being your wife means being his victim, I said, my voice clear and ringing in the quiet cafe, then I choose to lose everything before I lose myself one more time. I walked out into the cool, misty air, leaving him sitting alone with his cold coffee and his cowardice. I didn't look back. The grief was a sharp, physical pain in my chest, but beneath it, something else was stirring. A fierce, wild sense of liberation. Julian wouldn't fight for me. His family wanted to bury me. Fine. I would fight for myself. And I knew just who to call. That journalist friend. He owed me a favor from years ago. It was time to collect. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled afternoons. The initial shock had receded, replaced by a cold, determined focus. I met my friend, a grizzled investigative reporter named Mark, in a dimly lit corner of a downtown bar. He listened to my story without interruption, his expression growing more grim with each detail. "Alistair Sterling," he said, swirling the ice in his glass. "He's a ghost, Cora. His public image is scrubbed clean. He's got half the city council in his pocket, and the other half is scared of him. Going after him is like punching smoke." "Then we find something solid to punch," I replied, my voice harder than I expected. I spent the next week in the city archives, the place I once called my sanctuary. Now, it was my armory. I pored over decades of public records, property deeds, and business filings. I was looking for a pattern, a crack in the pristine facade of Sterling Holdings. It was tedious, painstaking work, but it was familiar. It was my language. And then I found it. A series of land deals in the city's industrial district, purchased for pennies on the dollar through a string of shell corporations, then rezoned for commercial development after hefty, untraceable donations were made to key political campaigns. It was a complex web, designed to be impenetrable. But my archivist's brain saw the connections, the threads that linked a dozen different companies back to a single law firm, the one Alistair Sterling had used for 40 years. I photographed every document, my hands steady. This wasn't just about a slap anymore. This was about a man who believed he was above the law, above decency, above everything. Meanwhile, the Sterlings were not idle. A sleek, black car began parking across the street from my apartment building at odd hours. My email was flooded with sophisticated phishing attempts. They were watching me, testing my defenses, trying to intimidate me into silence. Julian's texts became more desperate, a pathetic mix of pleading and veiled threats. "You're destroying our family, Cora. Dad's lawyers are getting involved. Stop this before it's too late." I ignored them all. I was building my case, piece by piece, document by document. But Mark was right, it was circumstantial. We needed something more. We needed a human element, someone from inside Alistair's world willing to talk. The idea came to me late one night as I was staring at a photograph from the party one a guest had posted online before the chaos erupted. In the background, partially obscured by a floral arrangement, was a face I recognized. A former executive assistant of Alistair's, a woman named Isabel, who had been abruptly fired a year ago with a generous severance package and a formidable non-disclosure agreement. At the time, the rumor was that she had been incompetent. But looking at her strained smile in the photo, I wondered if the truth was something else entirely. Finding her wasn't easy. She had moved out of state, changed her name. But I was an archivist. I knew how to follow a paper trail. I found her in a small town in Oregon, living a quiet life. I sent her an email, simple and direct. "I know what Alistair Sterling is capable of. I think you do, too. I'm not asking you to break your NDA. I'm asking you to help me find a way around it." For 3 days, there was no reply. I started to lose hope. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe she was too scared. Then, on the 4th morning, a one-line email appeared in my inbox. "There are documents in a storage unit. Unit 4B, Northport Storage. The key is under the loose brick by the fire hydrant." My heart leaped. I called Mark immediately. We met at the storage facility that afternoon. The air inside the metal corridor was cold and stale. We found the unit, the key exactly where she said it would be. The lock was stiff, but it finally gave way with a groan. The unit was filled with bankers' boxes. We spent hours sifting through them. And there it was. Not just evidence of the fraudulent land deals, but something much worse. Memos, emails, and internal reports detailing how Sterling Holdings had knowingly ignored safety violations at one of their timber mills, leading to an accident that had crippled a young worker. They had paid him off, buried the report, and blacklisted him from the industry. This was it. The solid thing we could punch. But as we were packing up the last box, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Cora Shaw. A man's voice, cold and official. It's Sterling, I corrected him automatically. Cora Sterling. Not for long, he said. There was a knock at my apartment door, loud and insistent. I suggest you go home. You've been served. The line went dead. Mark looked at me, his eyes wide. What is it? They're one step ahead of us, I whispered, a sickening dread coiling in my stomach. They're coming for me. The papers were a declaration of war. A lawsuit for defamation, slander, and emotional distress, coupled with a restraining order that barred me from coming within 500 feet of any Sterling family member or property. They painted me as a vengeful, unstable gold digger, fabricating stories to extort money from a grieving family. They had twisted my quiet nature into antisocial behavior, my grief over my broken marriage into manic obsession. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, designed to utterly discredit me before I could ever speak a word. I stood in my living room, the sheaf of papers trembling in my hand, and felt the floor drop out from under me. They weren't just fighting back, they were trying to erase me, to rewrite the story so thoroughly that I became the villain. I called Julian, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. He answered on the first ring. You did this, I choked out, the words tasting like ash. You let him do this. I warned you, Cora. His voice was cold, stripped of any of the warmth I had once loved. You wouldn't listen. You brought this on yourself. My father is just protecting his family. I was his family. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat. I was your wife. There was a pause. Then he said the words that would haunt me forever. You were a mistake, Cora. One we're now correcting. He hung up. I sank onto my couch, the legal documents sliding to the floor around me. I felt hollowed out, as if they had reached inside me and scooped out everything that made me who I was, leaving only a shell of fear and shame. For a long, dark hour, I considered giving up. I could run. I could disappear. Let them have their victory. The thought was a sweet, seductive poison. But then my eyes landed on the small, framed photo of my grandmother on my bookshelf. Her smile was kind, but her eyes were fierce. Don't you dare let them make your world small. A new feeling began to burn through the fog of despair, not just anger, but a righteous, white-hot fury. They had underestimated me. They saw the quiet archivist, the compliant wife. They didn't see the woman who had inherited her grandmother's iron will. They wanted to bury me in paper. Fine. I would build a fire with it. I called Mark. They filed a suit, I said, my voice shaking but clear. They're trying to silence me. It's a scare tactic, Cora. A slap suit. Meant to bleed you dry and shut you up. It's not going to work, I said. It's time. We release everything. The land deals, the mill accident, Isabel's evidence. All of it. When, he asked. I looked at the calendar. Next Saturday was the annual Sterling Foundation Charity Gala, the pinnacle of Port Meridian's social calendar, where Alastair Sterling played the role of the city's benevolent patriarch for an audience of cameras and wealthy donors. Next Saturday, I said. At exactly 9 p.m. Right in the middle of his speech. The week leading up to the gala was the longest of my life. Mark worked with his contacts at a national news outlet, preparing the story. My role was to stay quiet, to let the Sterlings believe their lawsuit had terrified me into submission. It was an agonizing wait, every shadow in the hallway a potential threat, every ring of the doorbell a jolt of panic. On the night of the gala, I didn't go to the event. I sat in my small apartment, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. I had the news channel on, the volume low. At 8:55 p.m., the broadcast cut to live coverage of the gala. Alastair Sterling was at the podium, his face beaming, basking in the applause. He began his speech, his voice smooth and resonant, speaking of community, of charity, of moral responsibility. The hypocrisy was so staggering it was almost beautiful. At 9 p.m. on the dot, I watched as a notification flashed on the news anchor's tablet. Her expression flickered. The ticker at the bottom of the screen changed. Sterling Holdings faces federal investigation for fraud, racketeering, and corporate cover-up. Inside the ballroom, a ripple went through the crowd as phones began to buzz in unison. Whispers turned to gasps. Alistair's confident smile faltered. He stared out at the sea of faces, his own face turning a blotchy red. He tried to continue his speech, but his voice cracked. "These are baseless accusations," he stammered. "A vicious attack on my family's good name by a disgruntled party." But it was too late. The story was out, supported by documents, emails, and a sworn affidavit from Isabel, whose NDA had been voided by the evidence of criminal activity. The cameras, which had been there to capture his philanthropy, were now capturing his spectacular, public implosion. As the chaos mounted, two men in dark suits walked calmly through the crowd and approached the stage. They weren't police, they were federal agents. They handed Alistair a subpoena, right there, under the glittering chandeliers of his own monument to himself. I watched as the man who had tried to break me, who had called me a clumsy fool and slapped me in front of the world, was unmade in front of that same world. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound, quiet, and bone-deep sense of relief. The weight I had been carrying for 3 years had finally been lifted. I turned off the television. The silence in my apartment was no longer threatening. It was peace. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. My new apartment was smaller, a modest one-bedroom in a neighborhood that didn't have a name, just a collection of streets. The view from my window wasn't of the sparkling Sound, but of a tangle of rooftops and the brick wall of the building next door. It was beautifully, wonderfully ordinary. For weeks, I had moved through a world of adrenaline and strategy. Now, in the quiet aftermath, there was only stillness. The news had been a firestorm. Alistair Sterling's empire was crumbling under the weight of federal investigations and public disgrace. His assets were frozen, his reputation shattered beyond repair. The lawsuit against me was quietly dropped, a footnote in a much larger, more ruinous story. I spent my days unpacking boxes, slowly rebuilding a life from the fragments of my old one. I bought a new set of coffee mugs. I filled a bookshelf with my favorite paperbacks. Each small act felt like a reclamation, a planting of a flag in this new, uncharted territory of my own making. One rainy afternoon, Julian called. I almost didn't answer, but some lingering curiosity, or perhaps a need for closure, made me pick up. "Cora," he said. His voice was different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out weariness. I'm sorry." I waited, saying nothing. "I was a coward," he continued, the words sounding foreign and difficult on his tongue. "I was so terrified of him, of losing everything, that I lost myself. I lost you. I see that now." He paused. "My father, he's broken. Everything is gone. Maybe now we could start over." The offer hung in the air, a ghost of a life I no longer wanted. I thought of the man I had loved, or the idea of the man I had loved. I felt a pang of sadness for him, for the weakness that had cost him so much. But I knew with absolute certainty that there was no going back. "No, Julian," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "I'm not rebuilding something on a foundation that was never solid. I'm building something new now. For myself." I could hear him take a shaky breath on the other end of the line, but I didn't wait for a reply. "I wish you peace, Julian," I said, and I meant it. Then I ended the call. That evening, I walked down to the waterfront, not the polished, touristy piers downtown, but a small, pebbled beach at the edge of my new neighborhood. The air was cold and clean, smelling of salt and rain. I watched the ferries, like steady, dependable beasts, glide across the gray water, their lights soft in the gathering dusk. For 3 years, I had lived in a gilded cage, trying to sing a song that wasn't mine. I had believed that love meant silence, that peace meant surrender. But the storm had washed it all away, leaving behind the hard, undeniable truth of who I was. I was Cora Shaw, a woman who had been raised by a grandmother who believed in the power of quiet things. A woman who had found her own voice not in a shout, but in the steady, persistent telling of her own story. The ashes of the Sterling Empire were not my burden to carry. They were the fertile ground from which my new life could grow. Standing there on the edge of the water, with the vast, open sky above me, I didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt like my grandmother's little bird, ready for the sky. I felt free.